Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Honorable Deputy Chairman of Committees, I am pleased to say a few words on the contents of the budget speech made by His Excellency the President. President Ranil Wickremesinghe perhaps maybe when you compare with his predecessors, with the exception of late President J.R. Jayawardena, would be the most economically literate president that we have got. So it is for that reason that sometimes when you look at the fundamentals of the budget that he has presented, there is not much for us to criticize because of the dire economic circumstances in which we are now placed. It is inevitable that we follow a different path than what we have followed earlier. So he has laid out the details of the framework within which this budget has been presented. In my speech, I would deal with some of the elements with some bouquets and some with brickbats, depending on the perception that we in the opposition have towards the proposals that have been made. Now, primarily speaking, first of all, let me point out about the civil liberties in this country. For us to have a stable economy, for us to have a proper judicial and law and order background, it is important for us to ensure that the people accept the rulers as legitimate. There's a question of legitimacy of this regime after what took place in the country from mid-April up to mid-July. We saw groundbreaking incidents which are now part of history. Now, be that as it may, it is very, very essential for us to ensure that we don't abuse the Prevention of Terrorism Act to deny civil liberties for the people in this country. Now, I am talking about Wasantha Mudalige and Venerable Sri Dhamma, who are held in custody for several days on end.
Today, 90 days today.
Today is 90th day, and tomorrow there is going to be a massive protest. Now, why are we heaping upon ourselves this misery? Why cannot we give them bail?
Protest today.
See, the protest is going to start today, I am told by Field Marshal Fonseca. So that being the case, now we gave an assurance to the Human Rights Commission in Geneva that we will follow a moratorium on the PTA until we reform the PTA. But we brought some cosmetic changes. That's about all. Now the entire international community is questioning this. Then how could we expect investors to come to this country when they see this kind of law and order situation? We are just heaping upon us unnecessary hardships. We are trying to suppress protests. We are trying to use or rather abuse the Prevention of Terrorism Act. So these are issues regarding which there are a lot of criticism. But then when it comes to the framework of this budget, let me go and describe the causality and the genesis of the the dire economic circumstances in which we are. Now, there are some historical trends. Now, we know at independence, we were only second to Japan in the socio-economic indicators, right? It so happened now Japan is somewhere else and we are at a different position. We are now declared ourselves bankrupt. I would like to ask His Excellency the President. He attended the funeral of late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Lot of expectations were created that he was going to get some bridging finance or some assurances from Japan for some bridging finance to tide over this difficult period. We expected him to say something about it in the budget speech. None was mentioned. But surprisingly, the Prime Minister's office in Japan or the Foreign Ministry spokesman also sought to deny certain statements made by our President's entourage after the meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister. So what happened to the bridging finance? That was to come. So today I see from the papers, well, I am told that the Japs are waiting for Chinese to agree regarding the debt restructuring of theirs. Now, I am told today in the papers, in the Economic Times, or rather the economic pages of Daily Mirror, China Development Bank team is in town for talks. A team of China Development Bank officials have arrived in Sri Lanka and held talks on projects financed by them. And the way forward, the minister said, CDB is one of the largest foreign lenders to Sri Lanka. So it goes on to say this. So maybe that the Japs are waiting now for the Chinese to give the nod. But then that was not the promise that was made. So anyway, be that as it may, now we have, as I told you, we have various historical factors. Now those are matters. We have had 2 civil wars. We have had civil disturbances in this country. We have had a prolonged war and a war against terrorism for 30-odd years. But at the conclusion of the war, then we went on a spending spree. We were a lower middle income country. At that time, we had enough access to concessional finance. Subsequently, when we became a lower middle income and subsequently a middle income country, right, we lost access to concessional finance. But then, of course, the international financial markets were open to us. So we went on a borrowing spree. And finally, what has resulted is that because of the indiscipline that we have had, we had to suffer this fate. Now, there are other exogenous factors like the COVID-19 pandemic, then the Easter Sunday attacks, also the Ukraine war. All of this have added on to the problems that we have now been faced with. But then, added to that is the man-made problems that we brought upon ourselves, the misguided policy issues, the ban on overnight ban on chemical fertilizers, then on the cutting the exact, or rather doing away with the revenue proposals, taking away the tax cuts that were introduced. Almost 600 billion rupees were lost, all of which exacerbated this issue. So now, in order to come out of this problem, I don't think we are at cross purposes with the President when he talks about the experience that he explained about the Vietnamese Prime Minister way back when he was in 1990s, when he was Minister of Industries, when they came for advice. The Sri Lankan foreign reserves was in the range of about 2.1 billion then. The Vietnamese foreign reserves were only $1.3 billion. Today, it's at 100 billion. And where are we today? We are only at 3.5 billion. That too is questionable. So these are issues that we are not at cross purposes with the President's statement here. Similarly, he talked about the Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew's cynical remark about Mrs. Bandaranaike and her policies. That to quote his own words, now he says, 1950s, Lee Kuan Yew once mentioned the following: in Singapore, I followed the hard but right path. Sri Lanka's Bandaranaike followed the popular path. Now, over a period of time, this has been the problem. It is a toxic mixture of populist politics, and added to that is our compulsive preoccupation in trying to have entrenched entitlement culture. Now, people want all freebies, everything free. Now, this is what has resulted in this dire economic circumstances that we are faced with. Therefore, now what we did was continuous fiscal deficits over a period of time. Then fiscal deficits are financed by the treasury all the time, forgetting the fact that there was always a revenue shortfall. We never reached the ambitious levels to which the revenue was to be collected. Now, even now, this budget talks about another almost 3,500 billion rupees in revenue. Is it realistic? Could we reach this target? Of course, the tax revenue will increase with the VAT based on inflationary position, that is, the inflationary prices will result in to a certain amount of tax being collected. But then we have to try and see whether these reforms that have been suggested. Now, let me talk about now, our problem has been always the fiscal forbearance on the monetary side. The monetary policies have got to go along with, it has to adjust itself when there is some fiscal forbearance. This has always happened. And that is why, way back when Indrajit Kumaraswamy was the governor, it was decided that the central bank will not participate in the primary auction for treasury bills. A decision was taken. But if that decision is to be implemented today, government will be in much more difficult situation. They will not be able to resort to this so-called high-powered money printing through the central bank participating in the primary auction of the treasury bills. Huh? You have stopped it, you say, but then the fact is the amount up to date, now up to 31st of August, 3,800 billion. 3,800 billion. So that's off the books. Now you roll it over, and you don't show it. But of course, you can't hoodwink the IMF. IMF knows that this is the position. So IMF is quite aware of what's happening. So therefore, now we need to, of course, the President talks about the state-owned enterprises reform. Now, we have to try and see the cost-reflective pricing has already started with the now petroleum products, and thereafter now electricity, water. We have now begun to try and implement what has been agreed at the staff level with the IMF team. Right? But in the meantime, how about disposal of assets? Now, there is so much of low-hanging fruit that we can get rid of. I am opposed to what others in the opposition trying to talk about not to privatize the insurance corporation, not to privatize some other Waters Edge and various other. These are low-hanging fruit we can get rid of easily. But then the question is there must be some transparency in how the final deal is struck, and this House must be kept informed as to what is going to happen. But in the meantime, the President also is talking about, then there is importance in the independence of the central bank. Now, independence of the central bank and this political fujigraphing with the central bank will have to stop. We have two good officials. The governor is a central banker himself, then the Treasury Secretary himself is also somebody who has come from those traditions. So we have good officials who are in charge. But then they must be given the independent role to play. They must. Then also we must bring the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Fiscal Responsibility Act is something that, though we have it, it lacks teeth. If there is a violation, there must be some punishment. Something must be imposed against the people who violate the Fiscal Responsibility Act and its provisions. So these are things that we have to try and do. Then the other is a business climate. The Doing Business Index. I'm told there is a committee now appointed and that some proposals are expected. I would like to also refer to some important suggestions made by the committee that has been appointed by the first report of the subcommittee in identifying short and medium-term programs related to economic stabilization of the National Council. Now, I also participated in some of these discussions. Honorable Champika Ranawaka, I think this is relevant to you, Honorable Minister of Health. He has made some important suggestions regarding the purchase of essentials. Now, we have to find, now I know vessels are staying outside with loads of fuel, but we can't find the dollars to pay. So days on end, they are anchored outside the harbor, and then we have to pay demurrage charges. We have had the similar experiences with medicines for your to purchase the medicines, we face the same problem. We have to find the dollars to purchase medicines. Now here, there are some important suggestions made by the committee, the subcommittee on by the National Council, appointed by Parliament after the latest reforms. Important suggestions have been made. It is reported that a sum of approximately rupees 160 billion is spent on importing pharmaceuticals annually, and 85% of that is spent on imports, US $380 million. Out of that, nearly 45% is public expenditure and 55% is private expenditure. Now here, there is also a suggestion that National Medicine Regulatory Authority, NMRA, regulates 14,000 different medicines. An independent expert committee should analyze these approved medicines and make arrangements to reduce their quantity.
Honourable Member, you have one more minute.
The importation of different varieties of medicines belonging to the same brand should be limited on the recommendations of an expert committee. These are some of the suggestions that are being made. To issue guidelines on emergency procurements by bringing the government procurement to 2 to 3 weeks. The aforesaid guidelines should be rescheduled to fall in line with the standards of various international institutions such as the Indian Line of Credit by which the provisions have been received, the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. Now, these are some suggestions. Yes, these are all very, very important suggestions. And similarly, how many minutes do I have?
Your time is already over.
I'm just finalizing. Finally,
Honourable Kaili Rambakala.
I finish. You can comment when you are speaking.
Honourable Minister, Honourable Rauf Hakim, please.
Yeah. So I am winding up. Now, similarly, on transportation, also some important suggestions have been made. I think these are all matters that the government must take into account. And all in all, we find, though there are some criticisms, then the other thing is unnecessary expenditure. The expenditure cuts. Now, defense expenditure has been increased by many billions. You see, this Akuregoda building, why can't we wait for a few more years? Why do you have to spend such a large sum of money for your defense secretariat? These are all, this is why there is some issues here. Of course, the Honourable President, His Excellency the President, had a smooth run in presenting the budget. There was hardly any heckling. Except for that Triloka Vijay Patra nonsense, when he spoke in parables about ganja, right? People were heckling him in the house. Apart from that, he didn't have any other heckling. Therefore, there is some kind of understanding on both sides of the aisle about the dire circumstances in which we are, and then we have accepted the broad framework, but then some of the policy issues, we have some disagreements, but still,
Member, please wind up.
Coming to approve this budget, I think we will look at it while we discuss it as an opposition together and decide what we should do. But in the meantime, let me anyway congratulate the President on his maiden budget, and since he is perhaps the most literate economically, apart from J.R. Jayawardena, among all the other presidents we have had. We expect him to fulfill the promises that have been made in time without wasting much of public expenditure on issues like this. Thank you.
Thank you.